Hi everyone, Professor Gustin here, and we are in chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about cell structure and function. And like a lot of the topics we do this semester, I'm going to give you kind of a foundational understanding of cells so we can talk about that in context of other things this semester. So this is not like every single detail about cells. In fact, you might have learned more details about cells in other courses, but I'm going to try to give you some things that we can build on and get to some bigger ideas. So the first thing when we're talking about cells is just to visit the cell theory. And remember when we were talking about scientific method, we talked about the idea of a theory, and a theory is a very well supported concept in science, and it's been tested in many ways by many different people over a long period of time. And so we've come up with the cell theory, and it seems to be holding true that all living things are made up of cells. And the cell is the basic unit of life. You know, when we look at the levels of complexity of the human body, we start it with atoms. Atoms are the simplest chemical unit. And when we bind atoms together, we have molecules. And molecules come together that we can have the parts of cells, or we can have big molecules, macromolecules. But then we can have the parts of the cells, and some of those are called organelles. But once we put a lot of organelles together and some other things, we actually get a cell. And so a cell is the simplest living unit, okay? The smallest thing that we can actually say is alive. So it is the basic unit of life. Another point in the cell theory is new cells arise only from pre-existing cells. And I think this picture is pretty cool. It's a picture from a microscope, and it's a kind of microscope, like a light microscope, like you could use in a teaching lab like we have, like a typical college. And you can see here, there's a nice cell, there's a single cell, there's lots of cells here. They all have a nucleus in them. We're going to talk about the nucleus. And inside the nucleus is the chromosomes. And the reason why I picked this picture is you can see that the nucleus is all kind of looks one way in this one, but here and here you start seeing that the chromosomes are starting to kind of pull apart. And when they pull apart, the cell divides. And these two cells, they kind of look just alike. So they actually recently just divided. It's like you took something like this and divide it, and now you're having the nucleus form again. And this is just a really good example of how new cells arise from pre-existing cells. So that's the cell theory. And what we would like to do is distinguish between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So you can take all the known cells on the planet and put them into one of these two categories. You might hear the prokaryotic cells called prokaryotes and the eukaryotic cells called eukaryotes. And again, this is a concept that you might have heard of in the past. And we're just going to build on this. We're just going to kind of summarize this and use these two examples during the semester. So a prokaryotic cell, or prokaryotes, are cells that do not have a nucleus. When we look back at the cells here, they were pretty easy to see. If there's a single cell, it's got a really obvious nucleus. But a prokaryotic cell does not have a nucleus, and whereas a eukaryotic cell does. So in that picture that I just showed you, they are obviously eukaryotic cells. You can see them quite easily with minimal microscope skills. And we're going to talk more about prokaryotic cells, and why they don't have a nucleus or what it looks like. But just to know that. In fact, the word prokaryote actually means pre, as in pro, and karyote refers to its nucleus. So these evolved before the nucleus evolved. So prokaryotes have been around on the planet for like 1.5 billion years longer than eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are composed of single cells. They can survive as single cells, but some of them hook together and make chains or clusters. But an individual single cell in a prokaryote can be a living organism, can be an organism to itself. Whereas eukaryotic cells, some of them are single cells, and we're going if you get to microbiology, you'll talk about yeast cells, for example. They're single cells, but most eukaryotes are multicellular. They have lots of cells making up the organism. We're going to talk a little bit about organelles, and prokaryotic cells have relatively few organelles, and I'm going to make some notable exceptions, whereas eukaryotic cells have lots of organelles. So if you took biology in high school or in a previous biology class in college, you probably learned a lot. You learned like mitochondria and Golgi and endoplasmic reticulum and all that. And there's lots of these different parts or organelles, and we're going to talk a little bit about them. You were learning about eukaryotic cells because there's not Golgi or mitochondria or ER in the prokaryotic cells. So most of what you've learned in the past, you've probably learned about eukaryotic cells. And the reason for that is the eukaryotic cells make up plants, animals, fungi, protozoa. Protozoa are kind of single-celled eukaryotes. They're things like you've heard of euglena and paramecium and amoebas, things like that. Fungi are like molds and mushrooms. Animals include us, humans, and here we are in human biology. So we're talking about eukaryotic cells making up animals. And so I think a lot of the biology we learn early on is kind of human focused, which is why we learn more about eukaryotic cells. And when you talk about prokaryotic cells, I'm going to be talking about bacteria. Now there actually are, you'll see in your book, there actually are some prokaryotes called archaea, but we're not going to talk really about them. Some people would kind of describe those as kind of weird bacteria, but they look like bacteria. They function a little bit differently, and they don't cause diseases. So we don't talk a lot about archaea in kind of an introductory discussion of prokaryotic cells. For our purposes, whenever I say prokaryote or you think of a prokaryote, think of bacteria. Eukaryotic cells make up every other kind of living organism on the planet. I want to make one note here that you might see is missing. And I think some of you are familiar with the concept of a virus. I mean, we're all familiar with the concept, maybe not the biology behind it. But viruses, which we will talk about when we have a short section on microbiology this semester. But a virus actually doesn't follow the rules of the cell theory. It doesn't have cellular structure. So we do not consider viruses as living. So they are neither prokaryotic nor eukaryotic. We kind of think they're more like really simple forms of life or kind of complex chemicals. So we're not talking about those here. All the living organisms are either made of eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells. So I want to continue on just a little bit more about cells in general, eukaryotes and prokaryotes, and just kind of a general statement about all cells. All cells have a plasma membrane. Now, depending on what website you're reading or what book you're using, they might call the plasma membrane the cytoplasmic membrane or the cell membrane. It all means the same thing. Your textbook uses the word plasma membrane, so I'm going to use that. But notice in these pictures, they're calling the cell membrane is the same thing as the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane surrounds the cell, and it surrounds the contents of the cell. So there's the plasma membrane for this one. On this one, the plasma membrane's right on the outside. But the plasma membrane surrounds the contents of the cell and controls what goes in and out of the cell. And when you think about that, that sounds pretty important. If you look at your house or any building that you're in, the walls and the doorways and all that are going to prevent everything from outside from coming in. And by having that, the barrier between the inside and the outside of your house or your whatever building you're in, it allows the inside to look different than the outside. So the plasma membrane controls what goes in and out of the cell, allowing the inside of the cell to look different than the outside. If they didn't look different, you wouldn't need cells, right? All cells also have a cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm are the contents inside the cell. and it's gonna be there's like it's kind of semi-fluid. It's kind of a thick fluid, and it's got all these parts kind of floating around in there, all these organelles. The organelles are, like I said, some of these unique parts inside of cells. Eukaryotes have more of them, different kinds than prokaryotes. But these are just kind of compartments that have unique functions. And so we're going to talk about some of the unique functions of the organelles that are in the cytoplasm. So at this point, I just want to show you one more thing about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. I wanted to compare the size of eukaryotic versus prokaryotic cells. And so here's kind of a cartoon showing you, here's E. coli, which is bacteria. So E. coli is a common kind of bacteria, and it's pretty small. It's in the micrometer range. And so we can see those under a light microscope, or the kind of microscope we use in the lab, but they look pretty tiny. Here's a red blood cell and a white blood cell, also called a lymphocyte, compared to an E. coli cell. So you can see that the E. coli is a prokaryote. These are eukaryotes. They're some of our own human cells, and you can see they're substantially larger than the E. coli. This one is a picture, and you're going to see this in lab also. These are two cells that have been scraped off from the inside of someone's cheek. So if you just scraped your finger on the inside of your mouth, inside of your cheek, you'd get some of these cells. And we do this in the live lab, that you can make a slide of cheek cells. And so here's two cheek cells from a human. So these are eukaryotic cells, and you notice that the nucleus is really obvious in each of these. But if you look carefully, the other thing you notice is there's all these weird little blue dots all over. And these blue dots are bacteria. They're prokaryotic cells. Now, cheek cells are substantially larger than red blood cells and white blood cells. You can see these are like 50 to 60 micrometers. So all these little dots are the prokaryotes, and the eukaryotes are much larger than the prokaryotes. So that's the main thing I want you to remember about the size. If you go to your book, there's a couple questions when you go to the ebook. Remember, when you're doing the questions for your lecture assignment, you can go between questions and reading back and forth. And within that reading, you're going to find the check your progress. And I would recommend you try to answer questions 1 and 2. The answers are in there with your, if you click on them, the answers are there in the ebook. I also want to make a note that for the rest of the lecture, for the rest of the videos, we're going to be talking specifically about eukaryotes. We will revisit the concept of prokaryotes later in the semester.